Welcome to today's webinar, A Global Paradox, for a discussion on wealth inequality driving, the associated disparity driving discontent. I'm going to lead this discussion, and I'll share with you in the course of this hour the Q&A, which was featured in the newsletter this week. I'll also want to engage those that have joined us as viewers in some of the associated discussions. Let me begin, and I'll share with you not so much the quantitative information, but qualitatively what this wealth inequality has meant and its association with the global paradox. So what KEI asked me is it asked me about the pressing issue of wealth inequality and its impact on society, starting with the broad question: what was my perspective on the current state of wealth inequality? The U.S. was clearly front and center in terms of the issue of wealth inequality. And so it asked me, as I noted, compared with Europe, that wealth inequality had grown to unprecedented levels, especially in the past few decades. That is, in the last 20 years, this is really exaggerated. The U.S. is in orange, Europe and Western Europe is in the bottom, but the whole point of that graph was to note that the top 10% of earners clearly exceeds the wealth of others. We're seeing a concentration of wealth in the hands of a few wealthy white homeowners. White and wealthy homeowners, meaning they've got equity, with significant liquid retirement savings, which not only stifles economic opportunities for the majority, but also leads to deeper social challenges. You'll see, I mean, that's a hockey stick and more, as you see what the distribution of family wealth up in the 99th, 95th, 90th percentile, leaving those behind it's almost negative when you're down in 10th percentile. There's people living with debt. They're not living with assets. So I'd found particularly insightful the Urban Institute's report that featured these charts, including a number of others, illustrating the wealth disparity between income groups, as is illustrated here, based on ethnicity, race, and gender. The huge and widening gap isn't sustainable in the long term. It fosters frustration, limits upward mobility, and fuels a sense of injustice, especially when economic growth doesn't benefit everyone. I guess the point there being that was written a few days before the U.S. election. I suspect, as we'll discuss next week, that those inequities have played a role in the expression of frustration, which we've seen illustrated by the 71 million that voted out the current candidate and voted in the former president, who claims that this issue he can resolve. And people's frustration that it hasn't been resolved, it's only grown greater in the last 20 years. KEI then went on to ask me, he said, many experts argue that wealth inequality, while surging dramatically, is a primary driver behind this frustration. And I said the reasons are multifaceted. Why has this happened? What is it that's contributed to this equity? Well, wage stagnation, as we know, people's wages have not risen, even though in some jurisdictions they've increased the minimum wage. Technological advances have come very fast without an adjustment in order to accommodate the displacement of labor. And those advances have been favoring high-skilled and capital-intensive industries, which haven't necessarily brought in the unskilled. And there are also policies that benefit capital owners, which are central factors. Now, those policies some see as the tax advantages to those that can escape the high tax rates, and that is the wealthy that can afford accountants and lawyers and figure out ways to escape the redistribution of their high wealth to the government, which would then reallocate to those in need. But globalization has also contributed by shifting jobs to lower cost labor markets. And that's one of the frustrations that the U.S. has expressed, and Canada too, about the low cost markets in Mexico and Asia, China in particular, in manufacturing. On top of that, tax systems in many countries increasingly favored the wealthy, allowing capital gains and inheritance wealth And I underscore inheritance wealth because as you well aware, it's a targeted area that I've noted over and over again, that the wealth accumulated by the baby boomers is at some point in time going to be transferred. And I felt that government will be unable to resist the temptation to tax that inheritance wealth. But today it goes untaxed or minimally taxed. Trickle-down economic programs are employed to encourage the wealthy to invest and reward their role in job creation and philanthropy and increase consumer spending. However, extensive research, and this came as somewhat a surprise to me because that trickle-down theory is one I've often felt that Reagan had introduced, and it seemed to have a lot of merit. But the research since then seems to indicate that the international experience is concluding that trickle-down theory doesn't work. And in fact, it contributes to further entrenching wealth inequality. KEI then went on and asked me whether or not there are racial and geographic factors imparting wealth inequality, especially in terms of home ownership. And I went on, based on the research that I'd done to prepare that article, that racial and geographic factors play a substantial role in shaping wealth inequality worldwide, particularly through disparities in home ownership. That's a major issue. If people can't get access to their home, can't afford it, can't handle the mortgages, or interest rates have skyrocketed, that has further contributed to the inequality in that those that have home ownership have wealth, those that don't envy it. So in the US, racial discrimination has also played a role in housing through segregation and unequal access to financing. It's limited home ownership opportunities, specifically for Black and Hispanic families. Even when they do own homes, properties in majority Black or Hispanic neighborhoods are often devalued compared to family homes dominated or that are predominantly in white areas, which further curtails wealth building potential. The geographic factors are also relevant and deepen this divide even further. In the US cities with high racial segregation like Detroit and Baltimore, Black residents face more barriers to home ownership and asset growth than in more integrated areas. But the economic opportunities do vary by state, with states in the Southeast and Midwest showing higher disparities and less mobility for Black and Hispanic communities compared to some coastal or urban regions. And as we'll discuss next week and maybe further today, it was those very regions that voted Democratic that were coastal and voted Republican that were not coastal in the Midwest and Southeast. For white residents, lower income families in regions like Appalachia, that's West Virginia, southern parts of Ohio, Western Pennsylvania, and parts of the Midwest are experiencing reduced upward mobility, driven by limited local resources and stagnant job markets, which amplifies class-based wealth gaps among white Americans as well. KEI then went on and asked about the role that modernization of farming has played in shaping wealth inequality and economic decline in rural areas. And as again we saw in the election, red tended to be in the middle, formerly farming areas. We see that issue in Saskatchewan, southern Alberta, and Manitoba as well here in Canada. The modernization of farming has reduced the demand for labor worldwide, driving urban migration, particularly in China, and affecting economic unrest and stability in rural communities, also in China and also in the US. The adoption of modern farming techniques, usage of fertilizer and pesticides, and now advanced technologies like automated harvesting and GPS-guided equipment favor large-scale farms with capital, reducing labor needs and making it difficult for smaller farms to compete without similar capital investments. As smaller farms struggle or close, rural economies suffer, leaving behind communities with fewer job opportunities and declining income levels and a frustrated populace or a migrating populace. The rural to urban migration has exacerbated the wealth inequality on a global scale, as the remaining rural residents often face limited access to resources like healthcare, education, and internet connectivity, which are essential for economic diversification. This lack of infrastructure, combined with depopulation, perpetuates economic hardship in rural communities. Children from these areas face barriers to higher education and well-paying jobs, leading to a cycle of intergenerational poverty. As a result, while modernization has benefited large farms, It's contributed to economic decline and wealth inequality in rural areas throughout the world, isolating these communities from the growth seen in more urbanized areas. We don't hear much about it, but it is certainly a fundamental issue concerning the parties in China of the discontent that's existing in these rural communities as they've built huge urban cities, many of which are unable to accommodate and provide job opportunities for people migrating from rural areas. Note for anyone following the US election and trying to understand how issues differ between red rural and inland states and blue urban and coastal states. Remember, this was written before the election. Wealth inequality is prevalent in red areas impacted by transitions in rural agricultural and energy economies, driving urbanization, and in blue urban areas with discriminatory housing regulations. How to resolve these inequities has been a prime issue in the election, and how to resolve them and whether they will be resolved after the election. KEI then went on with some people believing that wealth inequality is a natural byproduct of economic growth, and asked if I thought that was accurate. It may emerge as economies grow. Hopefully it's transitional. Extreme wealth inequality is, however, not inevitable. Growth can be inclusive if managed well. Policies can be designed to ensure that economic benefits are more evenly distributed. With progressive taxation policies, universal health care, and robust public education system, they can all help make sure that growth leads to broader prosperity. And I think, as I note later, and as may well be behind some of the illustrations of that wealth inequality in Europe, that Europe seems to be more advanced in introducing public policies to address the inequality, enabling people access to healthcare and education who don't naturally have the wealth to afford it. And so they have more socialistic offerings than what is the case in the US, or to a lesser extent, Canada. How would I describe the connection between wealth inequality and social discontent? That's the point. We've got inequality, but that doesn't necessarily lead to social discontent, or at some point it does. And when is the breaking point to arrive? And are there any specific examples or trend that it asked me that I could highlight? And I emphasize that there is, in fact, a strong link that as people feel the weight of rising costs in healthcare, education, and housing, while wages may stagnate, when wages stagnate, the frustration grows. We're seeing a breakdown in trust toward institutions perceived to be serving the elite rather than addressing the very people for whom those institutions were initially established. Look at the rising support for populist movements globally. These often gain traction by addressing the grievances of those left behind by traditional economic policies. People want to feel their efforts can lead to better lives, and when that's blocked by inequality, it breeds resentment. And I know in the last couple of days, there's been a lot of discussion about why is it that the Latino and Black vote in the US voted the way that they did, when in fact they appear to be the people suffering the most inequality. And the sense is that the institutions and the programs that have been instituted the last 2 years have not been working, and that their frustrations have grown. Which groups, in my view, are most affected by wealth inequality, and how does it impact their everyday lives? And I wanted to say that lower and middle income families are hardest hit. They're the ones struggling with stagnant wages while the cost of living rises. This disparity forces them to make tough choices, like whether to pay for healthcare or education, particularly in the US, where that is not provided, at least to the extent that it is in more socialized systems. Financial stress takes a toll not only on individual well-being, but also on family stability and mental health. It can restrict access to opportunities that allow people to improve their situation, creating a vicious cycle of disadvantage. KEI then went on to ask me, does wealth inequality contribute to political polarization? How did I see this affecting social cohesion? And I said, absolutely. Wealth inequality and political polarization often go hand in hand. When a significant portion of the population feels ignored or marginalized, they tend to align with political figures who promise radical change. This divide can weaken social cohesion as trust between different groups erodes and society becomes fractured into echo chambers, which feel they have little in comfort with one another. Again, even though this was written in advance, we seem to have anticipated some of the echoes which have been reflected in the the results of the recent election, at least in the South, and may be prescient of what may well be occurring in the North. I went on to respond to KEI's question of what role should government policy play in addressing wealth inequality. Are there any policies or programs that I believed would effectively address the issue? And I said that government policy is vital but not exclusive. Vital but not exclusive. That is, it alone will not achieve the ends that we seek. Progressive tax systems that require the wealthy to contribute proportionally more can make a huge difference. Universal health care, affordable education, and social safety nets have proven effective in reducing inequality in countries like the Nordic nations of Europe. These policies create a foundation for equal opportunity and help lift people out of poverty while still promoting a dynamic, innovative economy. But beyond government actions, KEI asks, what can businesses and individuals do to help reduce wealth inequality? Businesses can play a crucial role. They can adopt fair pay policies, provide comprehensive benefits, and ensure fair working conditions. Many large corporations have resources that can positively impact their communities if they prioritize equitable practices. On an individual level, people can support businesses that uphold these values and advocate for policies that support economic fairness. Small actions, when multiplied, can influence broader change. I wanted to emphasize the role that the individual themselves can play, however. The recent ESG movement advocated for policies to modify investing to address environmental, social, and governance issues and grievances. That movement has been muted, however, in the face of accusations of greenwashing, lack of standardization, and politicization. While ESG isn't likely to disappear, it may evolve to become more rigorous and focused on measurable material impacts. Investors and companies are seeking ways to refine ESG practices, making them more transparent, impactful, and aligned with corporate, ethical, and financial goals. We then turn to the distribution of wealth itself. Critics say wealth redistribution can stifle economic growth. How do you think societies can balance the concerns with needs for fairness? And I wanted to say it's a delicate balance, requiring, I believe, moderation in the redistribution efforts through fair tax policies and public investments in education, health, and infrastructure. It doesn't have to stifle growth. In fact, it can create a healthier economy by promoting productivity and consumer spending. When people feel secure and optimistic about their future, they're more likely to participate actively in the economy. We see, as KEI asks, that automation and AI are transforming the workforce and may well exacerbate wealth inequality. What measures did I think societies could take to adapt without leaving people behind? And I focused on education and retraining as being essential. The need to invest in helping workers transition into new roles where human skills are still vital. Universal basic income is one approach that could act as a safety net that requires careful planning and long-term sustainability. Societies that prepare workers for technological change can minimize its disruptives on inequality. And Mel will address that in a couple of weeks when we look specifically at the impact of technology and emerging technologies on global chaos and disruption. I saw education as a powerful tool for the playing field, for leveling it, but not on its own. It's just not enough. While education provides people with critical skills and opportunities, it must be part of a broader strategy that includes affordable housing, accessible healthcare, and fair wages. It's a multidimensional issue, and education alone can't address all the underlying economic and structural challenges. When I address education, I'm also including parenting, that for civil society is prime, fundamental, and core to almost everything we've been discussing. And finally, KEI asks if there was one change I could make today or recommend to address wealth inequality and reduce social discontent, what would it be? And I didn't say go to the voting booth. I said if I had to choose one at the public level, I'd push for a fair tax system. A progressive tax policy that works would ensure that wealthy contribute their fair share to the resources that support society, the public services, the infrastructure, the education, and the healthcare, to the extent that those tax benefits would in fact be directed to those systems. These investments would help reduce inequality and inequities by creating more opportunities for everyone, which in turn could foster a stronger, more resilient society and use the revenues through the tax redistribution system to provide a credit for first-time home buyers. Other measures might include universal early life wealth building accounts scaled to parents' wealth like the RISPs, the development of a universal sponsored retirement savings account, reform of the safety net program asset tests, and limit mortgage interest test deduction. Most of those recommendations come from on high and what the public might do, because that's what the question was addressing. But I wanted to add two things. First, that a serious constraint on many governments today is the size of their public debt. So we can make all the recommendations in the world that we want for government to spend more money on these systems, but in fact, the accumulated debt is really constraining the capacity of the public, of taxing of the wealthy, in that the funds are going to end up paying for on debt interest rates. The accumulated debt through misguided, politically inspired programs that have contributed to today's wealth disparity and increasing despair are frustrating. And I think we're seeing some of that frustration echoed in that election, as we'll talk about next week. Second, as you may have picked up from an earlier comment I made, I am very concerned that education, including parenting, is failing in the roles to prepare every generation to adapt to the array of changes they are and will face on a local and global scale. When the amount of time is spent on victimization, on LGBTQ, on issues of wokeism in the classroom, we're missing the opportunities for preparing our generation for the challenges that they have ahead. We need them to develop the skills and the awareness of what they can and will do, not just for themselves, but to make their communities more civil and more economically focused. So, humbling though it may be, KEI went on to say that North America may take a lesson from Europe, that despair need not continue with protesting growing, if society in general and governments specifically are to take inequality and wealth and opportunity seriously. So I've echoed the sentiments and the content of the article that was distributed last week, but an event has occurred since then. That was released on Sunday. The election was on Tuesday. And I had expected, as many of us, and I think you who are joining me today expected, that the election would take on a different direction, that the mannerisms would be serious, that the manners would matter, that while the economy and the inequities were serious, that the methods and the manners that were prevailing from one party would be so serious that people would accept the fact that we would continue with the party that was in power. That was not the case. And it may be a byproduct of the inequities that I've talked about being so serious that change has now happened, and that the frustration levels were exercised, not so much in the streets, but at the ballot box. And I get a little tingly when I hear that if democracy is going to work, rather than going and protesting in the street, the protests would occur in the ballot box. So maybe what has just happened was a democratic protest. And now we'll have to see whether that manner that was so serious to us will be muted and will be calmer, that the mandate has now been secured to make change in order to address those inequities in ways that may be necessary and not always popular. But there was clearly a moving away from the blue and moving to the red. So I'm going to open up discussion and see if anyone wants to challenge some of the perspectives that I shared in the newsletter, or maybe bring some of their own to the surface.
It's a complex question. Most of my Republican friends say equality of opportunity is what matters, and I personally agree with that. And there's a lot of things that stands in the way. If you drill down on diversity, equity, inclusion, DEI, it's all about allowing people to become the best versions of themselves. And there's a number of barriers to people being able to do that. One of them is definitely economic, but there are many, many others. So looking at those potential barriers, as our chief of police said, give us evidence of barriers and we will address them, or disproportionate outcomes, and we will address them. I'm not sure everyone having an equal income is a nirvana situation.
I don't think anyone is really pursuing equal income. I think what
But income disparity is a function of capitalism, which has provided wonderful innovation and has incented incredible developments. And part and parcel with capitalism comes wealth accumulation and wealth disparity. And if you didn't have capitalism, we probably wouldn't have all the progress that we've seen in the last 200 years.
But those that argue capitalism also argue that you need to mute some of the excesses, which we've referred to, of those inequities. And that's the role that the state does play through tax reallocation, of saying there's nothing wrong with government and taxation. That is a balance, it plays a balancing act.
There's a movement called conscious capitalism, and they've done they make the business case of taking care of people, your employees, your customers and communities, and taking care of your environmental footprint, you actually make more money. And that to me is.
We made some reference to that in the article of the role that corporations can play without waiting for government to step in. And if we have a civil society, we have corporations that are as respectful of the environment and of their employees, and that we don't need union pressure, and we don't need violence in the street, and we don't need violent strikes, that we can have a balancing act, get into negotiation and arrive at common agreement and resolve some of those inequities. But when it's not being resolved, people get frustrated.
And that's pure economic opportunity in my view. Globalization was an excellent thing to do 20 years ago, 30 years ago. And we're seeing the impacts of it. There's no industrial base left in the United States to speak of relative to what was in place 30 years ago. And we don't have a groundswell of people jumping to Trump. 5% of the electorate went red instead of blue, and they've gone the other way. Back when Obama won, for example, the numbers were almost the same. A number of working people don't see any prospects. They don't understand all of the agendas. They don't understand the fact that Trump might be a fascist. They don't understand how the checks on power work. All they know is they have a lot less money in their pocket, and that money that they do have, that they may have in their pockets, doesn't go as far as it did 4 years ago. So a simple economic argument with poor economic prospects, with the threat of people coming across the border, that's if that's your worldview. We're fortunate to be educated and have a much larger worldview, but there's a lot of people in the United States that don't.
Well, how many times have we heard, whether it was in Canada or in the US, that it was the economy stupid, and that the issues, some of which are portrayed as social issues, can in fact be interpreted as economic issues. And one of them, I heard a very interesting discussion today about the abortion vote. That many women were expressing that their position on abortion is because they can't afford to have a baby. And that, how many people have been translating that the issue is really a issue of the Supreme Court and of law, as opposed to an issue of affordability. Very interesting perspective of how many issues, in fact, got translated as economic issues.
I would just add one more thing, Perry.
Go ahead. When
you don't embrace the perspectives of workers that were the core of the Democratic Party.
I looked up a couple of things. I was not looking away out of disinterest or anything, but we see a curve, as you've shown, which is skewed very much to the right with the wealth in the U.S. And there are a lot more people on the left-hand side of that curve than on the right. But the weighted average income in Q4 2023 in the U.S. was $59,384. And the highest average earners were between 35 and 44 years old. 13.8% of them were above the national average. So they're right down near that middle left part of that curve. So we're talking about a handful of people in comparison to their population that have the largest amount of dollar bills in their basket. And it seems like money seems to translate to power. I have money, I can do something. And if they could only kind of get it all together and do it right, we might have something.
Well, that's where we get to the issue of the economy. Is if the haves are confident. The have-nots are not just envious; they're trying to shop. I have got a caretaker. She's from Africa. A wonderful, wonderful woman. I tell you, I am so happy with the caretaker that visits us each morning. And she indicated to me yesterday morning that the election had affected her, and that she wanted to talk about it. And I echoed my sentiment. She echoed hers, that we don't have racism, and yet racism has become such a huge issue. What she has is economic issues. And I was joking about, I don't visit the meat section of the supermarket anymore. The price of a roast beef is what I paid for my first Volkswagen. And she laughed and she said that her shopping cart is half of what it used to be as she shops for her family, and her son doesn't have any job prospects. Well, I can see the frustration of someone who's making a living visiting 14 different homes to help me and help others. I hadn't seen that population. That population exists in our communities, but we live in our little suburban enclaves. And I'm not sure how exposed we are to those 71 million in the US that voted their frustrations. I think that the white, educated, call them elite, call them privileged. The reality is, how much exposure do we have to where that frustration exists? Go ahead, Jeff. Kramer, you're up.
Yeah. I think that a large part of what's happened with the Democrats in the US is focusing on issues that aren't necessarily popular in the mainstream. So for instance, trans rights and stuff, and it's not that I'm opposed to that sort of thing, but I don't think that those are the issues that people really care about. And then, as was mentioned, not focusing on the workers. So, you know, if they were to come out with a platform that said, oh, we're going to reduce this gap and bring incomes like minimum wages to the place that they were, 30 or 40 years ago, just to bring in some parity, that would be more popular and resonating with the workers. But I also want to point out there's, two influential people that essentially had Democratic leanings that flipped over to the Republican side, and that's Elon Musk, who considered himself to be a liberal until he was spurned by the Biden administration and actively opposed in many of his efforts. And of course, RFK Jr., who would have liked to have had the opportunity to run for the leadership of the Democrats, but was not given that opportunity because first Biden didn't step down, and then second, Kamala was basically proclaimed by the party. If they had had a proper Democratic election within the party, things might have been different. They might have had a different candidate running.
Interesting that you raised that point, because something I was thinking about is people are frustrated being told what to do and what not to do by the state. And the LGBTQ issues and the wokeism issues essentially are coming from on high to tell people that you're a racist, you're privileged, you're not behaving properly, and that the state is frustrated. And I think what the people have said is, look, we're frustrated being told what we can and can't do. We've had it. We've had enough of being told what to do, ESG being another example. So I think what you're seeing in democracy is the point at which, of the people, by the people, they've spoken. And they've said, we have had enough of being told that we are socially irresponsible. And that was the point of the discussion I had with my caretaker, is I'm not a racist. He doesn't think I'm a racist. So why are our kids spending so much time in class being told we've got to fix a problem that maybe doesn't exist?
Yeah, and that white males are the enemy.
Well, the BBC was citing the statistics of how many white males in the US have considered suicide. Randall, I haven't heard from you. Go ahead.
Just one small point, I guess, that is that in terms of the wealth disparity, there are a couple thousand billionaires in the world, and we can't really conceive of what that means. We don't know how they live, and don't know their character. They seem to be obsessively, gathering, hoarding wealth and power two things. So my big concern is not the jealousy, because for myself, I like to think of myself on a path of self-actualization. What other people do is fine, but what I am concerned about is the way the billionaires use their money to influence things like elections and policy, and the media, the multimedia mechanisms that they use to persuade public opinion in their favor so that they can continue on the path that they're on. Meanwhile, on the other side of the equation is all of the consumers who continue to buy Microsoft products or Amazon, go shopping on Amazon, and have their social life on social media platforms, knowing that this hurts us, our local retail, our local economy, that social media is not a substitute for a real social interaction. We know all of this, but we continue to shop on Amazon. We continue to go to Facebook, and we continue to use Microsoft products. And people buy Teslas and so on. We continue to do this in spite of the fact that we know that the people are really trying to control our minds and our lives to perpetuate their positions of power. It's ironic.
Well, I think you've portrayed a profile of billionaires, which has a bit of a bias to it, because the Gates of this world and the Elon Musk of this world would say they spend a considerable amount of their wealth trying to give back and do something that would be of benefit to society, even though they as capitalists may ultimately become a beneficiary. So I'm not sure that what Amazon is doing, because I'm a victim of that. I'm probably buying something every other day through Amazon rather than going to the local store, because it's so convenient and it's delivered to my door. And people use Google because Google is better than the other search engines. So we've got a problem. What is the problem? People are using these things by choice. Nobody's telling them they have to. They have. It's called free expression and freedom.
True, but what is more subtle, though, is the ways which the super wealthy control the media, control the public policy, etc., for their own. That's hard to discern.
But whose problem is that? If that is a problem, we have a state, we have a regulator called the government that controls monopolies, looks at antitrust. Is the problem not there with government? Is that not what people are finally saying? Is, look, we want to use these tools. If there's a problem, it's not ours to solve, it's the regulator to solve, and the regulator is failing us.
We know that the millionaires, billionaires make huge contributions to both parties or all the parties, and we don't know exactly what policies are being purchased by those very wealthy individuals and companies.
Do they not have a parliament or a House of Representatives to make sure that we mute any of those excesses, that they don't become excessive? But it seems to me government is the problem there. Is if government is taking that money and then biased in terms of its actions, where's the check and balance? Okay. Well, this discussion will continue obviously throughout the week. I mean, the media has been shocked. And there's a reconciling going on. There's a message that has come out that they got it wrong, that somehow they, quote, have not been listening. And I look at CBC and the messages that are out repeatedly coming from CBC of telling people that you're all victims. We've got to further empower the state. I think what we're hearing is the people saying that we've had enough power going to the state, enough power going to the professionals, enough power going on high. It's time to recognize that we as individuals are why this society, why education, and why healthcare systems exist. You're spending too much time and attention on the supplier and not enough time on the consumer. That's a message which we've echoed over and over again, and I'm comforted. Even though I thought Kamala would win, I thought manners would matter more than the economy. I was wrong, and people have spoken. And they've spoken pretty loudly with 5 million more votes than the alternative. Now the other side still got 66 million, so we have clearly a split of the red and the blue. But the fact that the red now owns the House of Representatives, the Senate, and the White House, we're going to see some change.
I just wanted to say what I said earlier was that the Supreme Court is also Republican, significantly or majority. I think it's interesting. A friend of mine posted on Facebook. He said, "I think I now understand the Fermi paradox. Every race carries within it the seeds of its own destruction."
Well, or of its own reconstruction. I mean, if this election was for reform, not for the tyranny and the end of something, but and I listened to that Shark Tank guy speak about how this election is in fact a statement of reform, not of disaster, not of going ass backwards, but of rebuilding and getting rebalanced. We talk about the role of government and the role of the market. And if they're working well, things are in balance. Things seem to have gotten out of balance. And we're going to see whether or not they can be rebalanced or whether it is the end. I tend to be optimistic. I think the glass is half full. And I look at this election as an opportunity to see whether or not the changes that are called for by the 71 million will in fact occur.
Yeah, I think also those two people I mentioned earlier, RFK was brought into the Trump fold not because he liked Trump's policies, but because Trump said, "Hey, join me and I'll put you in charge of, making Americans healthier." And Elon Musk likewise intends to help to cut through government red tape and make things move more easily, which quite frankly, I think would be a good thing.
Yeah, the jury's out on RFK. I'm not quite sure that the policies and the positions and the data that he is referring to should in fact be guiding what we will be doing to people with removing fluorides and anti-vaxxers, but that'll play itself out too. We'll just have to see whether this system, House of Representatives and the Senate and the White House together formulate a better future. And we haven't talked at great length about what this means to Canada. To me, it's an echo chamber, and we're going to see very similar confidence emerging, and where people in Canada may well also be frustrated, but frustrated that they're not going to get change. Maybe, in fact, they're ready to take common action as well.
I think Pierre Poilievre is probably going to win this next election just because of the frustration that people have with the Trudeau government.
Well, I don't think it took Trump to give him the confidence, but I think his confidence level should be surging. Go ahead, Greg.
So there's two words that Trump mentioned in his acceptance speech that he didn't run on. There's two words that A Better Calgary Party is talking about, which is our municipal party that we've just started. And there's two words that Pierre Poilievre speaks of. And the two words are common sense.
Yeah, sure.
So you take those 5 or 10% of the electorate that are just saying, "Hey, I'm not doing well. Right. I'm going to vote for change." Yeah. All they're looking for is common sense. I've got a city of Calgary that couldn't deliver water to my home all summer. Yet they can talk about wokeism to put a label on it. They're putting up $1 million pieces of architecture all over the city that are useless, that are ridiculous. If you've been by the Calgary airport, there's a 80-foot blue ring stuck on top of an overpass that costs $500,000. That means nothing to nobody. That is not common sense. Not delivering water to my door, not taking care of roads.
There's something quite comforting in seeing the restoration of common sense versus ideology. There's something quite comforting in saying that the student in the classroom is important, not the teacher. Not to say the teacher, not to dismiss the teacher, not to dismiss the doctor or the system, but to restore the comfort that we should have that it's people that these systems exist for. And why that message had to be, why we needed a sledgehammer to get that message through is beyond me, but it's apparent that it was called for.
So what has taken us away from common sense? When we built these systems, we built hospitals to take care of sick people. We built schools to educate people. I think what's happened is the people leading have become so educated and so full of incredible ideas that they've lost some of that common sense.
I think my answer is that the world has just become too complicated to be manageable. And it's really at the top where things get most complicated because they have to come up with policies on how to run a whole nation in the context of a global political economy. So they're overwhelmed.
The arrival of the wheel made things more complicated. The fact of the matter is that human institutions and human beings have been able to adapt to complexity over time.
Up till now.
I'm arguing that the pursuit of knowledge and the pursuit of progress sometimes brings about inequities, and human progress is addressing those inequities. And we are watching right now an inequity. We have rapid emerging technology. That's what this theme is all about. Global chaos is a byproduct of a number of forces. We're talking wealth inequality today. We'll be talking about neoliberalism and policies next week, and we'll be talking technology the week after that. You're absolutely right. There's complexity. All these forces converging at the same time are challenging our systems of government, are challenging our systems of healthcare and education, which, as Greg has pointed out, we've spent so much time on supply and on building supply that maybe we forgot that these supplies were being built for people. And common sense says it's time to restore the attention, not to the PhD, but to the people who that PhD was supposed to serve. And instead of being celebrated that we got goddamn PhD, and I'm not picking on you, Tommy, because I got one too, we've spent an enormous amount of the assets and resources of society on the knowledge economy, on pontificating the value of those that know, as opposed to those that need to know. It's the need to know that's the market that's been ignored.
And I think the Republicans are going to have a free pass to burn down the US federal bureaucracy, if that's what they choose to do, up to and including burning it all down and building it back up. And someone like Elon Musk has got a good track record in doing that. And the guardrails for that may not be the courts, Jeff.
I'm not going to forget.
May not be, it certainly won't be the House and the Senate.
I'm not going to forget the theme, though, Greg, that I shared before this all started of manners matter. Maybe manners didn't matter in terms of winning an election, but I think manners will matter in terms of whether or not it's civil action that is taken in order to bring about and achieve the mission. So I'm very interested to seeing how deportation is to take place. I'm very interested to see how we are going to end the wars. I'm very interested to see how we will reverse the manufacturing flow of jobs out of the US. So he's got the mandate, he's got the power, he could be a tyrant, or he could be civil in his mannerisms, which will enable him to get his party to get reelected after this. Or his manner can be offensive, rude and chaotic, and really frustrate a lot of people. And it'll be a short, but it'll be a 4-year difficult, chaotic mandate, and it'll be over in 4 years. So the jury's out. We're watching. We now believe that common sense will prevail, but common sense should bring with it some degree of good manners. Shirley?
I know I attended a union meeting the other day, and just by a way of introduction and icebreaking, they asked a question, you know, what would you want more of? Do you want more friends? Do you want more recreational time? There was some other ones, and then, or do you want more money? Well, guess what the resounding answer was? So that I think is a huge reason why Trump got elected, regardless of whether you like him or not, which I can't say I do, but
No,
will happen. I am very concerned about pressures coming from the states and what they do with their immigration problem, and whether they're all coming across the border based on the fact that the system crashed already, where people trying to get out of the country. So time will tell, I guess.
I think the point, I mean, issues clearly trumped manner or character. We thought it would be an election on character. It turned out being an election on issues, and the primary issue being the economy.
Well, I'm wondering what's going to happen when Trump does not and is unable to fulfill any of these promises. And one of the worst things I can see happening is that they'll give away or destroy the Ukraine, give tremendous power to Russia, will become unstoppable. And
We'll just have to see what evolves. It's clear. He was pretty clear on what it is he'd like to see achieved. He wasn't particularly articulate in terms of how he was going to go about doing it, and we'll just have to see whether the how is civil. Jeff?
Perry, I was just going to say, I saw something online this morning that I haven't validated, but it seemed to ring true to me just anecdotally, is that in 2024, there's not one developed democracy in which the incumbent party survived an election. And then I heard on a podcast I was listening to, someone was talking about how Trump in his first term, he failed in getting reelected in 2020 because of how he was perceived to have mishandled COVID. So he was the incumbent in 2020 and he lost. And now Biden, as the incumbent, dealing with the inflationary impact of the stimulus and dealing with all of the economic inequality, as you've been talking about those issues, they lost in spite of Kamala Harris running, by all many accounts, I thought it was a brilliant campaign. But then there's, as you've talked about already, if you look at the map of the counties and where the red is and where the blue is, what you see is this. It's not the coastal elites that went red. I mean, there was movement in those areas, even in the urban centers, but it was the heartland of the country, the people who are most directly affected by this lack of opportunity, the scarcity that they're experiencing. And they spoke, as you've said. They sent a very clear message, and the incumbent failed. I think that bodes ill for Trudeau here in Canada. I think Poilievre will capitalize on this. And if Trump doesn't perform, he'll be the incumbent and he'll get tossed out next time, if there's going to be an election next time, which I think is also an open question. And by the way, your point, Tommy, about Ukraine, Wall Street Journal leaked today some of Trump's plan for solving the war in Ukraine. And the high points are that Putin gets the 20% of Ukraine that he's already occupied, and Ukraine forgoes the opportunity to join NATO for 20 years. Yeah. That's the resolution that Trump apparently has kind of cobbled together in the background, which I think is a disaster.
I'm also interested in how he how he proposes to address Iran. I mean, Iran equates to Hezbollah, Hamas, and Houthi. That's the source of conflict in the Middle East. Fortunately, there's a single player there, and that's Iran, and how he's going to deal with that. But I want to come back with the wrap up, Jeff, to something you pointed out and elaborate on it. The one map that really impressed me was the map that showed how many counties in the United States showed an increase. They maybe didn't go over into red, but they showed an increase, including Brooklyn and Yonkers and downtown Manhattan. Virtually every county in the United States showed an increase. That's astounding. And with the increase on the other side, it was virtually empty. So this was massive. This was a massive statement. And as you pointed out, around the world right now, I don't think the U.S. is the only one. I think some are envious that the U.S. may well be taking this position. But it's time to reestablish some common sense, as Jeff has pointed out, and recognize the importance of the people for which these systems exist, including the distribution of wealth and taxation. So,
but I think also the discussion about whether it's student loan forgiveness or what people see as DEI programs in the heartland, those advantages of those initiatives aren't seen to be flowing to those individuals in the heartland. And they're not benefiting from that to the same extent that the sort of more economically advantaged peoples on the west and east coasts are seeing or understanding the advantages of that, and so they engender resentment and not support.
Well, as Jeff has echoed and as Randall just shared, we are going to see 4 years, hopefully, of common sense, but we'll see it executed in a manner we hope that recognizes the importance of good manners.